All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the International Methods Colloquium. I'm Justin Essery, Associate Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Wake Forest University. The International Methods Colloquium is a periodic online seminar, interactive seminar discussion on the application of quantitative statistical methodology to the social sciences, sponsored by Wake Forest University and previously sponsored by Rice University and the National Science Foundation. This week's speaker is Kevin Munger, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Princeton Center for the Study of Democratic Politics and assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Penn State University starting next year. The talk is entitled Insufficient Variation in Treatment Moderators, the Limitations of Mechanical Turk for Studying Digital Media Effects. This is joint work with Mario Luca, Jonathan Nagler, and Jonathan Tucker. Kevin's talk will last about 30 to 40 minutes, after which point we'll take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. And you can ask questions at any time during the talk, but all questions will be held to the end of the presentation. A link to Kevin's slideshow will be available in the Zoom webinar chat window so that you may refer to it throughout the presentation. And I'll post that link to the slides right after I'm done with this message. Now I'd like to welcome Kevin Munger to the IMC. Kevin, welcome.
All right, thanks, Justin. I'm excited to be here. So this series is mostly about, as you said, quantitative work, and the current presentation is a kind of interesting twist on this because I'll be talking a little bit about the ways in which the kind of digital media experiments we'd like to be able to conduct sometimes can fail, and for reasons that are not obviously found within the data themselves. So I'm going to be talking about a series of experiments that failed, and I mean this is in the sense that we did estimate precise treatment effects, but they are null treatment effects. And as a methodologist, I think it's important to talk not just about best statistical practices, but about best practices in terms of how we actually conduct experiments. And in contexts like studying digital media effects, where this is all pretty novel, I think it's particularly helpful to share best practices and potential pitfalls. So I'm going to talk about our experience as researchers in conducting this research. I'm going to do some, I guess, methodological self-criticism to explain the design choices that we made that could have been made better in order to draw better inferences. And I want to then broaden this discussion to talk about the field in general and figure out how we can improve future studies that want to answer the kind of questions that we aimed to answer. So substantively, and I'm going to give far too little attention to this portion of the research project because I want to spend a lot of time talking about the methods, we were interested in clickbait. So clickbait, we'd argue, is an understudied but extremely important form of online media. So a huge amount of what we see on the internet every day, either directly on homepages, on news feeds, on Twitter, can be characterized to a greater or lesser extent as clickbait. So the questions we want to answer: first, what types of people are actually likely to consume clickbait? What are the implications of reading clickbait headlines for these downstream democratic normative issues that political scientists have been studying recently, particularly effective polarization? So does clickbait take partisan headlines and make the polarizing effect worse? Does it decrease trust in media? Are people that are exposed to clickbait, do they feel that they've been taken advantage of? And potentially it might also increase information retention. So if it causes people to be more emotionally aroused, they might be paying more attention. So there might be an offsetting effect here. We sort of conceptualize this as related to the discussion about soft news. And so clickbait is in some cases has an analogous effect as soft news. At least that was our theory. And sort of methodologically, the thing we wanted to solve was how do we actually identify the relevant population? So when we do media effect studies, we've come to realize that it's important to estimate the effect on the people who would actually read it. The counterfactual of what is the effect on someone who would never be exposed to clickbait is just not an interesting quantity. So we want to figure out what the actual quantity of interest is. So briefly, what do we mean when we say clickbait? So I don't want to be too prescriptive in defining exactly what clickbait is. I think it is, first of all, not new. I mean, the act of clicking is new, but clickbait is part of the strategy employed by media companies, and media company strategies are always dependent on the technological, political, and regulatory context in which they find themselves. So the theory here is that when there's a new technology that comes along, and as long as regulations aren't too strict, it lowers the cost of news production and distribution. We see more entrants into the media market competing for attention. And this leads to clickbait. So this is where people are deciding what news to consume at the point of consumption. So it's not subscription based. It's not looking at broadcast television where the news is just coming in and you're sitting there passively observing it. You actively are making the choice about what news to consume based on the headline. So this has happened several times in the history of media technology. Perhaps the most dramatic example was in the late 19th century when the penny press, so because of the cost of newspaper, the actual paper decreased and the technology for printing became much more efficient. It was possible to produce a lot more physical copies of a newspaper than it was before. And this meant that there was competition for attention, but in this case, it was on street corners where newsboys are saying, extra, extra, read all about it. Destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy. And this sort of famously contributed to, at least potentially, the involvement of the United States in the Spanish-American War. So this type of media environment always seems to obtain whenever there's a new technology like this. And in this case, the new technology that we're interested in is the internet. And so now the cost of producing and distributing an individual piece of news is extremely low. And as a result, we've seen a massive proliferation in the number of media firms. And in order to compete, they are pushing their headlines to the extreme, becoming just trying to attract attention any way they can. So that's how we're thinking about clickbait. The specific type of clickbait we're studying is called partisan emotional clickbait. And I don't want to spend too much time on the theory. Again, we're going to get to the methods. But what we're doing here is basically just taking a partisan headline and we're adding the phrase, for example, Republicans are shocked, or Democrats will hate to hear this. So just giving some kind of additional information about the social context of the news and making it seem more important is how we're defining clickbait. The specific format clickbait takes always changes over time and is contingent on lots of factors, but that's what we're talking about in this experiment. So the actual experiment was just an online survey experiment. The first step is to ask respondents to choose which story we'd like to read. So we give them a fixed choice between 4 different stories. This allows us to estimate the individual level preference for clickbait. So we're able to answer that question of what type of people are the most likely to consume clickbait. Right. And then we get to the experimental portion where we're going to randomly assign respondents to one of 4 headlines. The story itself is held constant. So in this sense, it's kind of a conservative test. We're only varying the headline. So here we've got 4 different headlines, 2 by 2. It's either Democrat or Republican leaning, and it either has that emotional clickbait frame, so Republicans will hate this, or it does not. And that's how we define emotional clickbait versus the traditional headline. And after that, we just ask the standard questions for measuring the quantities of interest here, which are effective polarization, trust in media, and information retention. And I should note that we did a short pilot, and after which, because this is all just data from Qualtrics, we are able to pre-register the R code that we use to analyze all of the experimental results. So we just take the new data, run it through the code that already exists, and you get all of the results. I think this is a nice way to do pre-registration. This is what that first task looks like. So here's the Qualtrics preview on mobile. They're asked to choose which of these 4 stories they'd like to read. Notice that we have 2 stories here which are not political, and I think it's important to include these non-political stories when we're doing media choice experiments, because otherwise the preference for co-partisan median, for example, is going to be inflated. A lot of people are always going to read about Brad Pitt, and it's not, if they're not given that choice, they might have a slight preference for reading Democrat-leading news, but it's important to capture that, how much interest they have in news in general. And we see here that we have one story that is sort of Republican-leaning, so this is something that Republicans, it flatters their intuitions that the travel ban was popular. And this one was Democratic leaning. This is supposed to flatter their intuitions. It says, evidence shows Donald Trump Jr. conspired with the Russians. And we see here that we have that emotional clickbait at the beginning. It says, "This will make you furious." So we do this 8 times, and this allows us to estimate first the preference for Republican or Democrat leaning news, and then the preference for clickbait. So the percentage of the news stories that you chose to consume, what percentage of them were clickbait? So we did this on 2 different samples, and I'm going to get back to this in a bit, but I just want to show you the descriptive results first. The first was just mechanical Turk, a pretty standard method and one that we'll be critiquing for doing these kind of experiments. And we oversampled Republicans to make sure that we got a balanced sample. Only the first survey actually had that preference for clickbait battery because we thought it might be damping treatment effects on the second time. We did the same thing on a sample of subjects collected via Facebook ads. And I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. But I just want to give you the overview of the results, these descriptive results, and this is the preference for clickbait. So on the right 2 columns, first we have the preference for Republican content, and this is meant to be pretty much just a sanity check. And so we see that there's pretty much no significant results on any of these other covariates, but on the partisanship questions, we observe exactly what we would expect, and it's pretty much the same across the 2 samples. So Democrats have a lower preference for Republican content, and as we move to the right, the preference for Republican content increases pretty much monotonically. So that means that that's exactly what we'd expect. People are, in fact, choosing news stories that appeal to their partisanship. But now we look at the preference for clickbait. And here, it's important to note that there are differences between the MTurk and Facebook samples. So the most consistent results are actually about partisanship. It seems that Democrats consistently have a lower preference for clickbait, which is not something that we'd expected, but we do find that on both of the samples. The other important commonality is in age. So older people have a higher preference for clickbait. And that's true across both samples, but it's better estimated on the Facebook sample. Also on the Facebook sample, we find that more educated people have a lower preference for clickbait, which also is consistent with what we'd expect. And the reason why I think we're finding these effects on these samples, on the Facebook sample, but not the MTurk sample, is because there's not enough variation in these quantities among the MTurk sample. And I will talk a bit more about why I think that once we get to the sampling section. So I want to talk about the experimental results first. And as I said at the beginning, they are not encouraging, or at least they were not what we'd hoped to find. So we did the first MTurk study and didn't get no precisely estimated null results. So we thought, well, let's change the topic of the articles. Maybe the topic we chose was not, the right one, and we added a placebo condition to make sure, as a manipulation check, to make sure, for example, that people who read the stories actually remembered more information from those stories. And they did, but there was still no result other than if you read any story that contains information, you have gained some information relative to the placebo. So that's evidence that they were reading it, but this does not give us any more evidence for the hypotheses we wanted to test. So here we shortened the survey that removed that beginning battery, which we thought might dampen treatment effects. Again, nothing. Again, same results. So we start thinking at this point that perhaps mechanical Turk is the problem. Okay. So we have plenty of evidence coming out recently, especially this year, that many classic non-digital experiments do replicate on MTurk. We've seen this also from econ-style experiments. So this is the kind of experiments where people have to have some kind of monetary incentive for their decision-making, the dictator games, these kind of things. And even more recently, we find just massive, really impressive efforts to replicate 27 framing, priming, and information survey experiments. And these folks are able to replicate both the average treatment effect and the conditional average treatment effect given on breakdowns of age and gender, I believe. So as long as you can control, as long as you know the respondent's age and gender, you're able to estimate their treatment effect on all of these different experiments pretty consistently. And that's great. But there is an issue here that's only possible if you are looking for already theorized treatment moderators. So in order to do this kind of replication, you have to know what kind of treatment moderators you're looking for. And in this case, I think there are differences between MTurk and other samples on specific treatment moderators for specific types of tasks. So for the experiments in this paper, they were able to replicate them, but that is not generalized to all experiments and all conditional average treatment effects. And specifically, we're going to argue that mechanical Turk users are all above a certain threshold of digital literacy. And digital literacy is a potentially important moderator of these treatment effects. So taking a step back here, we want to think about exactly the type of people we want to have in this experiment. And the type of people who click on clickbait is this is the population of interest, right? So we don't think clickbait has any effect on people who don't click on clickbait, perhaps. So to do that, we identified, well, we ran a ad campaign on Facebook with the most clickbaity type of ad that our IRB would let us use. So the idea here was to attract people who are the type of people who click on Facebook ads are plausibly the type of people who click on clickbait on Facebook. It's not an identical conceptual match, but it's closer than any other sampling frame that we could think of. So we've identified these people this way, and we can look at the just breakdown of the demographics of these two samples. So we see that the Facebook sample is much more female than the MTurk sample, and this is also related to age. So it turns out that the Facebook population is just, there's more older women relative to other demographics in terms of both usership and time spent on the platform. So this is pretty consistent with what we expect to find. Overall, we do see fewer Republicans and Democrats across both samples, but it's not terrible. And the other major difference here is in Facebook use. Plausibly, the people who we found on Facebook use Facebook more often. But the most important demographic here is age, right? So age is absolutely related to digital literacy, and we don't have a direct measure of digital literacy in this experiment. We didn't think to put it in there. So that's certainly something moving forward. But age has been shown to be a pretty strong proxy for it, especially among people who use the internet. So we see that the MTurk sample, we dramatically oversample people who are 25 to 35, right? They're way more than the overall population. This is just the white bar here is from the census. But on Facebook, we actually oversample people who are 50 to 75, right? So the type of people who we are interested in studying are in this age range more than any other age range. And so this is perhaps the population of interest, right? We do want to weight not to the overall population, but to the population of interest, which is the type of people who click on clickbait. So we have identified very different populations on this dimension, and yet we didn't actually get any significant results from the Facebook study. So our conclusion here at first was we did everything we could. We got the right sample, and we still didn't find results. But then we look at the attrition from the two samples. And we see, first of all, I mean, the main thing is that the attrition from the Facebook sample is larger than the MTurk sample. That's pretty what we'd expect. But there are not parallel trends in when people stop taking the survey. So some people just click and only open the survey and then leave. That's fine. This is the period when they were doing all of those choice tasks, and this takes a long time. So this would have been if people were simply worried about the survey taking too long, this is when they might have left, and there's pretty parallel trends here. But then we have the new tab. And so the actual experimental manipulation showed them a hyperlink with the headline. The headline was being manipulated, and they were asked to click on the headline, and this took them to a new tab. And from the new tab, they were supposed to read the story and then go back to the original tab. And we see here that there is massive attrition in the Facebook sample at this stage, and pretty minor attrition from the MTurk sample at this stage. So, and then afterwards, there's also a pretty long portion, and there's pretty much no attrition there. So the main effect here is a lot of our Facebook sample, roughly 25% of the initial sample, is leaving when they're asked to open a new tab and then read the story and return. So we are now going to conclude that attrition is not random, and it covariated with demographics of interest. So this makes it really challenging to actually draw any inferences, right? So if we look at the distribution of the ages of the Facebook sample at these different attrition points. Among the population in red of people who finished the survey, they were dramatically younger on average than the rest of the stopping points. And for the people who left at the new tab, this is precisely the oversample here of people. Even here, we're looking at this peaks at like 65. So the 65-year-olds are the ones most likely to have left at the new tab. And this is only true among the Facebook sample, right? So among the MTurk sample, the graphs are basically identical. The blue tab, there are very few people left at other stages, so this is kind of noisy. But between the people who finished and people who left the new tab, it's pretty much identical throughout the entire distribution. So there's something going on about age and the Facebook sample in terms of their ability or their desire to finish the survey. So we want to figure out what predicts stopping at this new tab. So we're just going to combine all of the data and run just a fully interactive model to look at differential effects. And we don't really have a lot of, so these are just coefficient plots. So here's the effect of age on stopping at a new tab. And this is just the same information as on the previous graphs, but it's pretty stark. So on MTurk, there is no effect of age at predicting whether or not you stopped at the new tab, but on Facebook, the older you are, by far the more likely you are to have stopped at the new tab. So I'm going to talk about attention checks. So attention checks are sometimes, or often, this is kind of the best practice, included when you're working with Mechanical Turk and other online samples to make sure that you're getting quality data. So in addition to the 8 descriptive tasks we had them do, we had one attention check here. So here, the correct choice here was survey taker, always select this option, ignore the other 3 headlines. So if you're paying attention at all and you read all of these, you should be pretty likely to click on this. And we see that on MTurk, 82% of people did pick this. Actually, that was a little low, lower than I would have expected, but clearly they understood what was going on. They're used to doing these kind of tasks with attention checks. On Facebook, this is 57%. And that's, the base rate is 25%. So that's really shockingly poor, I would say. And the sort of our initial response here is that maybe all of this data is just pretty bad. They're not paying attention at all. They're just trying to click through. So I actually don't think that's the case. And that attention checks might function differently with digitally naive populations than they do among the digital experts on MTurk. So here, we're able to take from Qualtrics the amount of time people spent on the attention check and see how that predicts how that relates to their having stopped at a new tab. So on Mechanical Turk, there's no relationship. So having spent more time on the attention check question does not mean that you were more likely to stop at the new tab. But on Facebook, it does. So the people who spent more time looking at this attention check question were also more likely to stop at the new tab. And that's not true for any of the other choice tasks. So there's no relationship on either sample in the other choice tasks between how much time they spent and whether they stopped at the new tab. So the inference, well, what I'm trying to get at here is that the type of people who were confused by the attention check, and I actually got several emails from people in the Facebook sample saying, I don't understand what this question means. These people were also the ones who were likely to stop at the new tab. And I'm suggesting, and I don't know for sure, but I think this is related to digital literacy. So we can also see what type of people missed the attention checks. And this is the same plot as above. And here we see that age has a significant effect in both samples, but in the opposite direction. So in MTurk, older people were less likely to miss the attention check, and this is consistent with a body of evidence that older people taking surveys tend to be more conscientious. But on Facebook, the older people were more likely to miss the attention check, again suggesting that if age is related to digital literacy, that this is the crucial predictor of how they responded to the attention check, not whether they were paying attention. One more piece of kind of forensics we're doing on the survey, and this is something I call digital dexterity, which pun very much intended here. So the question is, how old are you? And this is an open response question, first question on the survey. All but 3 of the 2,000 MTurkers put in a 2-digit response. These 3 put in these numbers, which suggests they might have been bots. However, 39 Facebookers entered things like 71 years, 78 and not senile, and this whole sentence here, and then a typo like this. So both in terms of data quality and the fact that these people might be categorically different than other people, I think it's very helpful to have observed this. So they don't have the same intuitions about how data might be used as the mechanical Turkers do. They all know if we put in a number, it's very easy to put that into some statistical software and work with. But many of them just typed out these, just typed out 71 years in words. And so these type of people were very different in their ages. So on Facebook, the average age of people who entered a 2-digit age was 45, and the average age of people who entered a non-2-digit response was 63. And that's just coded. I coded these 39 responses. So I want to now discuss some qualitative evidence from the experience of older people using Mechanical Turk. So this is a great paper, and these folks have interviewed older non-MTurk users and found they can't do basic tasks on MTurk. So first, they just told them, the older people, what crowd work is. And the idea was a lot of older people would like to have something to do that makes them feel helpful and makes them feel engaged. And so this might be a fruitful collaboration in terms of getting more people and more representative people into the population on these platforms. So they encourage these people to sign up and just do basic standard MTurk tasks. And of these people, the modal respondent said that they'd been using the internet for 10 years or more. So these are not people who have never used the internet, not at all. And here's a couple quotes. So many participants were not familiar or comfortable with opening content in new tabs or windows. How do I get back to the instructions? There's too many things to remember all at once. One of my complaints is that if you open up a new box and you go back to what you're working on, the box is gone, you can't just look up and reference it. So this is specifically talking about that issue that we identified with opening up new tabs. This seems to be not intuitive to people, and this poses a big problem for actually doing good science. These barriers, which may seem trivial from a requester's perspective, significantly affected older adults' abilities and time to complete the tasks. Some of them also feel bad about it. I just think I'm not smart enough to do it. I just don't understand anything they were telling me to do. I'm a complete failure. I don't even understand the instructions. Is everybody else this dumb as I am? So in addition to getting bad data, we're actually sort of causing harm in subject populations if we are not taking into account the difficulties of engaging in or conducting digital tasks that are trivial to us, right? So building on this data, I want to take this one step back and think about the type of questions and the type of survey instruments or just research designs we use as researchers. So this is a conception of reflexivity, thinking about our own experiences as researchers and applying it to the research we do. So I think that our intuitions in these areas, they're not just insufficient, they're actively misleading. So in general, models that describe us don't necessarily describe most people. We are in many ways distinct, and it's always important to remember this when we are designing research and asking the types of questions we want to ask. I came across this when I was doing a series of Twitter bot experiments. So I have bots that I control, and I have them send pretty stilted messages to people. And a common response I got was, this is kind of silly. These are obviously bots. Why would anyone respond to this? And the answer is that they're obviously bots to us, but not to most people. And so this is important to remember, is just how different people who don't spend all of their time thinking about research experience the world compared to people like us who do. Right, and so it was not obvious to non-social scientists. And this is particularly important in a topic that actually Pablo Barbera talked about 2 weeks ago on this IMC. And if you didn't watch that talk, you definitely should. So online echo chambers. A lot of academic research has gone into debating this question of echo chambers. And so specifically, we're defining an echo chamber as the people who go on the internet are more likely to only see things they agree with than people who are not on the internet. That's an online echo chamber, that it exacerbates the trend towards homophily in news consumption. And my reading of the literature here, and this is, Pablo agrees with this if you watch his talk, they don't really exist, except among specific groups of users and people who are in specialized partisan or professional networks. Here, we do have echo chambers relative to what would happen if we were not on the internet and social media. And this includes social scientists and journalists. So building on our own experience, we were likely to be in echo chambers. And we thus thought echo chambers must be a big problem. Now, thankfully, thanks to lots of really high quality experiments, using the scientific method, we were able to empirically falsify the concern about ubiquitous echo chambers. And that's great. And I mean, that means that it is possible to do these things and to use our tools as social scientists to overcome whatever bias our intuitions might contain. But the issue here is that the supply of social science research is inelastic. So there are really serious opportunity costs to having spent all this time investigating these questions rather than other questions. And I think this is best illustrated in the discussion between online echo chambers and fake news. So this is what Bourdieu calls the scholastic view of generalizing our own experiences to everyone, and the people we study especially. So online echo chambers were experienced by social scientists. Fake news not. We are not the type of people who are likely to find deliberate misinformation and click on it and share it because we find it credible. It's also the case that neither of these things are experienced on average. So the modal person on Facebook experiences neither of these things. It's also true that specific subpopulations experience both of these things, right? So there are people on Facebook who have clicked on and shared fake news, and there are people who have experienced online echo chambers. And how does this affect how we have studied it? I claim that this means that we have studied echo chambers too much relative to their existence and importance, and we've studied fake news too late because we spent all of our time studying echo chambers. So if we just look at number of hits in a Google Scholar search in political science, in the 10 years before the 2016 election, we see a ton of research on echo chambers and basically nothing on fake news. And if you put in misinformation and restrict that to online information, it looks pretty much the same. And then after the 2016 election, this completely shifts. So no one is really talking about echo chambers anymore. Now everyone's talking about fake news, which I think is pretty plausible, except that the problem here is that if we had been more attuned to how other people experience the internet and less attuned to how we experience the internet, we might have been better able to see the problem of fake news coming before it was an issue. So I think that's what we should aspire to as social scientists, particularly because this is from Matt Genskow's recent working paper. It looks like on Facebook, they've already started to solve the problem of fake news, at least as how it existed in 2016. So across these other categories, there's basically just a standard straight trend here. On fake news, we see it spiked in 2017, right around the election, and now is way back down to pre-2015 levels. So right as we are, as academics, ramping up, hiring postdocs, learning how to work with this data, theorizing new stuff, these questions are becoming less relevant than they were. And that's why I think it's important to do qualitative research to understand the types of things that are likely to be important to a lot of people who are not us now and in the future. And I just bringing this back to the point about mechanical Turk and generalizability, I want to talk about this paper about the generalizability of survey experiments. The upside here is that in general, we do find that survey experiments generalize. There are specific cases in which they don't. So their example is that some convenience samples are inappropriate, such as a student sample where a moderator is age. So if you think age moderates treatment effects and you're only looking at people who are 18 to 21, you don't have enough variation in that moderator. The upshot of this paper is that any sample with a hard digital literacy cutoff is inappropriate for making generalizations about online behaviors. And for the reasons we've outlined, this definitely excludes mechanical Turk. And more troublingly, and what we'd hoped to avoid, is that even that Facebook sample, which was an oversample of digital naives, was unable to actually produce a sample of people that varied on digital literacy, at least a sample of people that finished the survey that had sufficient variation on this quantity of interest. So one more kind of general point about how we should be thinking about treatment effects here. Should we expect treatment effects to be homogeneous or heterogeneous? So if treatment effects are generally homogeneous, it doesn't really matter what kind of sample you have. Convenience samples are fine. But there are some cases in which clearly we do have non-homogeneous treatment effects. And what should the default be? Should we expect there to be homogeneous treatment effects unless we have a specific reason to think otherwise, or the opposite? Do we have to always look for heterogeneous effects unless we have strong evidence that effects are homogeneous? An important critique here is that most of the extant estimated heterogeneous effects are post hoc and underpowered. So I think just in practice, a lot of the heterogeneous effects analysis that has been done is not very credible. And I think that's important when we're designing studies, but that doesn't mean that heterogeneous effects don't necessarily exist. So one recent case where there has been a huge concern about heterogeneity is in psych experiments. And all of the psych experiments were run on weird subjects. This is Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And the concern was a lot of the psychological mechanisms that were being documented would not generalize to subjects in different populations. So there's this great open science research agenda called Many Labs, where people from universities around the institutions around the world collaborate, run identical protocols, have a massive sample size, and are thus able to actually test this. And this paper that just came out actually really demonstrated that there's not that much variation between weird and non-weird subjects. So this concern about treatment heterogeneity in these psych experiments seems like it was overblown in this case. However, if you look at development econ and we look at the field experiments there is massive heterogeneity. And heterogeneity here is kind of equivalent to generalizability. So the more heterogeneity is, the harder it is to generalize, because the more different kinds of covariates you need to account for and wait for and just know about. So my take here, and I'm not sure that everyone will agree with this, is that effect homogeneity in lab survey experiments is evidence of their artificiality rather than evidence in general that treatment effects are homogeneous. So I guess I would lean towards the position that we should expect effects to be heterogeneous until they're proven otherwise, but I could certainly see lots of debate on this point. And this is an important point for all sorts of experiments and social science in general. In the particular domain that I'm interested in, though, tying it back into the specific survey experiment we ran, the internet-based surveys that study online behavior are thus more like field experiments and thus more likely to experience heterogeneity than internet-based surveys that study something else. So there's also evidence for massive treatment heterogeneity among digital populations based on age. So from this working paper about how often people shared fake news using web tracking data, users over 65 shared nearly 7 times as many articles from fake news domains as the youngest age group. So that's a real heterogeneous treatment effect. That is not something you need a huge amount of power to detect. But if you do have a huge amount of power, so this is the famous Facebook Get Out the Vote experiment, which has a 61 million person sample size. The effect of this social cue to go out and vote, the effect size for those 50 years of age and older versus those 18 to 24 is 4 times as large for self-reported voting and nearly 8 times as large for information seeking. So again, in this particular domain, there is strong evidence for treatment heterogeneity. So just wrapping up here, how are we going to take whatever these insights or critiques and apply them for doing better research? So I think research design needs to incorporate digital literacy, ideally explicit measures of digital literacy, and these are the best ones thus far have been developed by sociologist Esther Hargitay and her co-authors. So this is just a survey battery that you can put in there and to see how actually test what I've only been able to hint at with the data that I have, which is that digital literacy moderates treatment effects for online behavior. You also want to run a pilot on low digital literacy populations to make sure they actually understand how everything works, to make sure they can actually finish the survey as you intend. In particular, this is going to vary based on the devices that are used. So are people using mobile, desktop, or tablet? And I think, for example, the issue of stopping at a new tab is much bigger problem for people who are doing this survey on their cell phone than people on a desktop. And I don't have information about that, but I think that would have been really helpful for further diagnosing what went wrong in this experiment. I also want to think about, is device use part of the experiment? So are we interested in studying how people use the internet, or should we hold that constant, right? So we might have more control if we make everyone use a tablet that we provide, but that might be less environmentally valid, ecologically valid. So we also want to make sure that the type of people that do use it on mobile, that if that's covariant with other demographics, that's going to potentially pose a problem for inference as well. So in this case, I could have just made the stories appear in line. We could have just not had the click to new tab, and that would have made this much more accessible. And I think I should have done that, and I will if I try to replicate this in the future. Also, for digitally naive populations, pay close attention to attention checks, and don't just assume that people who miss an attention check is producing garbage data. They might be confused, and so don't necessarily just throw out all of that data. Furthermore, you want to have at least one open response question to get some other measure of how people are engaging with your survey. And the conclusion here is that this is going to produce better data, and it's also going to improve the subject experience. So it's really, it's unfortunate to read about those older folks trying Mechanical Turk for the first time, because it seemed like they suffered serious self-esteem problems, and we certainly don't want to be causing that in our survey populations, especially if that's going to lead to us getting worse data. So that's it. Yeah, that's all I have. Justin?
Okay. All right. Thank you, Kevin, for that presentation. At this point, Kevin Munger is available to take questions from the audience. You can ask a question using the Zoom Q&A button that appears at the bottom of the webinar window. While we're waiting for some questions to come in from the audience, a lot of your description, or a lot of your analysis, was about sort of why you were seeing results in the MTurk study that you didn't see in the Facebook study, if I sort of understand some of the motivating factor there. The reason why you were digging in is because you were seeing these conflicting results. Can you just summarize, like, what does this mean for digital literacy, not as a sort of confounding variable or like a factor that is screwing up your experiments, but for digital literacy as a variable in and of its own, in its own right? So, for example, if we were interested in the effect of fake news on voting behavior, how does digital literacy impact that? Or how does digital literacy directly impact how people consume news? Is there anything we can sort of take from your study?
So this is the reason why I was digging in, is because we did not have the foresight to actually ask the question about digital literacy. And so that's why I was doing all of this forensics about this question. So I don't have the answer right now. Mm-hmm. And what I'm hoping to do is try to replicate some experiments that are theorized to be moderated by digital literacy on different samples, and actually test this question directly. So the reason why I'm presenting this paper is that that's what we were trying to do, basically. And there were all of these unexpected problems that prevented us from succeeding. And I'm really hoping to help other people avoid these problems. And also it helped me think through exactly what went wrong and how to improve my own studies.
Based on the data you have about Clickbait, you obviously have statistically significant, if not large, results in the MTurk population. Is there anything we can conclude from the sort of that subsample of data? Can we draw conclusions about, for example, I noticed certain partisan populations, I believe Democrats were less likely to click on clickbaity titles compared to Republicans. Is there anything we can conclude, at least for some subpopulation, from that data?
I think so. And I think that's why all of these other studies that have been coming out recently about generalizing from MTurk samples to other samples are helpful. And that is that on certain dimensions, and I think partisanship is one of them, it's pretty representative, or at least you have enough you don't need it to be fully representative. You just need to have enough variation in the treatment moderators. So I think that you should be able to reweight those results to the population of interest. And I think that that is, yeah, absolutely of interest. And the fact that we found them on both samples is especially encouraging that there is, in fact, something there.
Mm-hmm. I noticed you cited the recent study that showed that the MTurk results match a lot of what we found in other samples. And as you noted, the takeaway from that is that, or at least the takeaway that is offered, is that heterogeneity is not as big of a problem as we think. And you actually come to the opposite conclusion, right? You cite that analysis, and then you come to the conclusion, well, actually, heterogeneity probably is really important because we see it in this digital literacy sort of frame, and we see it in cases where the internet is really the most apparent object of study. I guess my question about this is, how would we know if you were wrong, right? How would we know if you were right or wrong? How can we design some studies to probe whether this heterogeneity is sort of something we really need to be concerned about or not a big deal, other than what we've already done?
Right. So I think that those studies, that study in particular, Copper, Mullenix, and Leeper, Kopic, Mullenix, and Leeper, it's great, and it demonstrates that for those specific types of questions, heterogeneity is not really a problem, and that's really helpful. I mean, that really means that we don't have to worry about it, and we can do these experimental media samples, and that's great. The issue that I'm taking is that does not mean that heterogeneity doesn't exist in general. And I think that it's kind of an open epistemological question about what our prior should be in different domains as to whether or not heterogeneity is an issue. I don't know the answer, and I think that we need to kind of, as a discipline, figure out what we think. But then once we have that prior, we actually have to just do all of these experiments to make sure. I do believe that the internet is, the questions that take the internet as its object of study are likely to have a lot of heterogeneity. I think that if we think about what does Facebook use? Like, everyone who goes on Facebook sees a different Facebook, right? So here, it's not treatment effect heterogeneity, it's treatment heterogeneity. There's actually a unique treatment for every single person. And especially if this is moderated by something like, how well they understand the dynamics of the internet, this is likely to have dramatic effects. And so I think that this, especially right now, we might be in a kind of period of disequilibrium where a lot of older people who have very little digital experience are getting onto Facebook for the first time. Actually, people over 65 are the fastest growing population on Facebook in the US right now. So especially while this is going on, and we have older people who have no intuitions about how the internet works exposed to like a fully operational Russian disinformation campaign, the effect of this is likely to be massive, at least for now. And so my take is that our prior for these kinds of questions should be that heterogeneity is a big problem. But again, I haven't tested it for sure, and I want to do these kind of experiments to demonstrate this one way or another.
I'm going to go ahead, since there are no questions from the audience, I'm going to go ahead and thank Kevin Munger for being our presenter at this week's IMC. I want to note that his presentation will be posted to our website shortly after this broadcast if you'd like to share this presentation with a colleague or watch it again later. I also want to announce that this is the last talk of the fall 2018 semester, but I'd like to invite you to join us on Friday, February 1st, when we will host a talk by Michelle Torres of Rice University. Please see our website, www.methods-colloquium.com, to get more information about this talk. Kevin, thanks very much for being our guest today.
Thanks, Justin.
All right, and I hope to see everyone next semester.